Dear students, I am Amin. I am teaching in the Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University. As you know, in the previous lecture, I have discussed the organization, functions, and powers of the UN Security Council. Today, in this lecture, we are going to discuss UN Security Council's role and the challenges which it faces while discharging its duties, its functions. UN Security Council is the main organ within the UN system responsible for maintaining international peace and security, as outlined in the UN Charter. So, UN Security Council is regarded as world's peacekeeper. Though UN Security Council is mainly a peace maintainer body, but it also plays other roles as well, like promoter of democracy, international law, human rights. First, we will try to understand the role of UN Security Council as a peacekeeper. In other words, we will try to understand that how UN Security Council maintains and establishes international peace and security. UN Security Council tries to maintain peace and security by trying to resolve conflicts between nations or within nations by issuing resolutions that outline steps for peaceful negotiations, for peaceful settlements. For example, in 2005, the UN Security Council helped to broker a peace agreement between the government of Sudan and rebel groups, with the aim to end the violence and establish a framework for political reconciliation in Sudan. Another example is UN Security Council involvement in facilitating talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban to negotiate a peace agreement and end decades-old conflict in Afghanistan. Sometimes UN Security Council also encourages dialogue and mediation efforts to prevent conflicts from escalation. For instance, in the case of tensions between India and Pakistan, the UN Security Council has repeatedly called for both parties to engage in dialogue to address their differences peacefully. But when peaceful means fail to address threats to peace and security, the UN Security Council imposes sanctions on states or non-state actors. These sanctions can include economic, military, or diplomatic measures to pressurize parties to comply with international law and seize activities that pose a threat to peace. For example, UN Security Council imposed sanctions on North Korea for its nuclear weapons program and on Russia for its actions in Ukraine. As a last resort, in order to maintain international peace and security, sometimes UN Security Council also uses force. For instance, the UN Security Council allowed military intervention in Libya in 2011 to protect civilians from government-led violence during the Arab Spring uprising. Sometimes UN Security Council also uses peacekeeping operations to maintain international peace and security. These missions involve deployment of troops, police, civilian personnel to help stabilize situations, to protect civilians, to facilitate the peace process. For example, the UN Security Council deployed peacekeeping forces in South Sudan to protect civilians during the civil war and support the implementation of the peace agreement. So, we can say that UN Security Council serves as a key international institution tasked with maintaining world peace and security through a wide range of diplomatic, political, and, when necessary, coercive measures. The UN Security Council also plays a significant role in the codification of international law, primarily through its actions, through its resolutions and decisions. The UN Security Council's resolutions and decisions often establish legal norms and principles that become part of international law. These norms can cover a wide range of issues like use of force, human rights, humanitarian law, and the resolution of conflicts. For example, Resolution 1373, which was adopted after the 9/11 terrorist attack, this resolution established legal obligations for states to combat terrorism, including measures to prevent terrorist financing and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. In addition to setting the legal norms, the UN Security Council is also responsible for the enforcement of international law, particularly concerning to threats to international peace and security. The Council's decisions and actions, such as military interventions, imposition of sanctions, serve to enforce existing international legal norms. For example, Resolution 1973 allowed military intervention in Libya in 2011 to protect civilians. It highlights the UN Security Council's role in enforcing humanitarian principles and the responsibility to protect the doctrine. The UN Security Council has also established international tribunals to address specific issues, to address specific conflicts, and hold individuals accountable for the violation of international law. For example, the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda to prosecute individuals responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed during conflicts. The UN Security Council also imposes sanctions on states or individuals to enforce compliance with international law or to address threats to peace and security. These sanctions often codify legal obligations and prohibitions under international law. For instance, sanctions imposed on North Korea in response to its nuclear weapons program reflect the UN Security Council's efforts to enforce non-proliferation norms and obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Through these decisions, through these resolutions, the UN Security Council also contributes to the clarification and interpretation of legal principles and norms which are essential for the international law, as these interpretations help to shape and refine international legal norms over time. We can say that UN Security Council plays a crucial role in the codification of international law through its actions, decisions, establishment of legal norms, enforcement mechanisms, creation of international tribunals, imposition of sanctions, and clarification of legal principles. Security Council's efforts contribute to the development, interpretation, and enforcement of international law, thereby promoting peace, security, and justice at the global level. The role of UN Security Council in human rights is complex and often subject to debate due to the Council's primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. While the UN Security Council is not explicitly mandated to address human rights issues under the UN Charter, it plays an important role in relation to the human rights. Dear students, the UN Security Council has recognized the relationship between human rights violations and threats to international peace and security, particularly in conflict-affected areas. Through resolutions and mandates, the Council often addresses human rights abuses perpetrated during conflicts and authorizes peacekeeping missions to protect civilians. For example, in the case of conflicts such as in Syria, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic, the UN Security Council has deployed peacekeeping operations with mandates to protect civilians from violence, including human rights abuse. The UN Security Council also refers situations involving serious human rights violations, war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity to international tribunals such as the International Criminal Court. This criminal court is tasked with prosecuting individuals responsible for human rights. Dear students, in certain cases, the UN Security Council also imposes targeted sanctions, including asset freezing and travel bans against individuals, entities, or governments responsible for human rights violations. For instance, sanctions may be imposed on individuals involved in perpetrating mass atrocities such as genocide, crimes against humanity. These sanctions aim to hold perpetrators accountable and prevent future violations. Though UN Security Council is primarily responsible for maintaining peace and security, but sometimes it also holds debates, discussions on human rights situations in specific countries or regions, particularly when they pose a threat to international peace and security. These discussions, these debates can raise awareness, generate diplomatic pressure, and encourage dialogue to address human rights concerns. However, such discussions, such debates are often subject to political considerations and can be contentious within the Council. So we can say that though UN Security Council's primary mandate is to address threats to international peace and security, its actions and decisions often intersect with human rights issues, reflecting the recognition that human rights violations can have significant implications for world peace and security. However, UN Security Council's role in human rights remains complex and subject to ongoing debate and discussion. Dear students, the UN Security Council also plays a significant role in disarmament process to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and promote international peace and security. Now the question is how UN Security Council promotes disarmament. First is by passing resolutions. It means that UN Security Council can adopt resolutions to address disarmament issues, such as elimination of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. For example, Resolution 1540, which was adopted in 2004, calls on all states to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, their means of delivery, and related materials to non-state actors. The UN Security Council also enforces compliance with arms control agreements and treaties to promote disarmament. For instance, the UN Security Council oversees the implementation of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which is shortly known as NPT, and may take action against states found in violation of this treaty's obligations. In addition to this, the UN Security Council supports efforts to negotiate and implement arms control agreements such as the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty between USA and Russia. The UN Security Council, in order to prevent nuclear arms, may also impose sanctions on states or entities to compel compliance with disarmament obligations. These sanctions can include restrictions on trade, financial transactions, and travel. For example, the UN Security Council imposed sanctions on North Korea in response to its nuclear weapons program, aiming to pressurize it to abandon its nuclear program and to return to disarmament negotiation. It is clear from this discussion that UN Security Council plays a critical role in promoting disarmament and arms control efforts worldwide through its resolutions, enforcement mechanisms, and imposition of sanctions. By addressing disarmament, the UN Security Council contributes to the maintenance of international peace and security and the prevention of conflicts fueled by proliferation of nuclear weapons. The UN Security Council also plays an important role in addressing present challenges and threats such as terrorism and climate change. Though UN Security Council's primary mandate lies in the maintenance of international peace and security, the UN Security Council considers terrorism as a threat to international peace and security, therefore adopted resolutions and measures to combat terrorism, terrorist organizations, disrupting their financial networks, and strengthening international cooperation in counter-terrorism efforts. For example, in response to the 9/11 terrorist attack, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1373, which established binding obligations on all member states to prevent and combat terrorism, including measures to criminalize terrorist activities, freeze terrorist assets, and enhance international cooperation in intelligence sharing and law enforcement. Dear students, as you know, another emerging threat is climate change. While climate change is not traditionally within the UN Security Council's mandate, however, the Council has recognized the security implications of climate change. For example, the UN Security Council held an area formula meeting on climate security, which recognized the relationship between climate change and security threats. This meeting provided an opportunity for member states and experts to discuss the security implications of climate change. The United Nations Security Council does not have a direct mandate for the promotion of democracy and good governance, as its primary responsibility is the maintenance of international peace and security. However, the UN Security Council occasionally addresses issues related to democracy and governance when they have implications for peace and security. The UN Security Council may address governance issues in countries experiencing conflict or instability, as poor governance can be a root cause of conflict. By promoting inclusive and accountable governance structures, the UN Security Council can contribute to conflict prevention and resolution. For example, in its resolutions on conflict-affected countries such as Afghanistan, the UN Security Council has emphasized the importance of inclusive governance and the rule of law in achieving sustainable peace. So, UN Security Council upholds the principles of democracy, rule of law, and good governance as essential components of a stable and peaceful international order. By promoting adherence to international norms and conventions, the UN Security Council indirectly supports efforts to strengthen democratic governance at the national level. This includes advocating for respect for human rights, freedoms, and democratic principles in member states' domestic affairs. While the UN Security Council's role in the promotion of democracy and good governance is an indirect and often subject to political considerations, its actions and decisions can influence governance outcomes in countries facing conflict, instability, or authoritarian rule. By addressing governance challenges within the context of its peace and security mandate, the UN Security Council contributes to building more peaceful, inclusive, and democratic societies. So, dear students, these are the areas where UN Security Council plays its role to ensure world peace. Now, let's try to understand the challenges which UN Security Council faces while discharging its role and functions. The first challenge which UN Security Council faces is veto politics. Its effectiveness is often hindered by this veto politics, particularly among its permanent members. The permanent members use their veto to block solutions that are not in their national interest, even if they are critical for addressing urgent security concerns. This results in the UN Security Council's inability to take timely and decisive action in response to conflicts and crises. For example, during the Syrian crisis, numerous attempts were made to pass resolutions, but these attempts failed due to disagreements between veto holding powers. Therefore, it resulted into prolonged suffering and humanitarian crisis in Syria. This veto politics also prevented UN Security Council to take decisive action in the present Ukraine crisis. Another challenge which UN Security Council is facing is its limited enforcement capacity. Despite UN Security Council's authority to enforce its resolutions, the UN Security Council often faces challenges in enforcing them effectively. Like in the case of North Korea, multiple resolutions were passed to impose sanctions. But these efforts failed to prevent North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons. So it underscores the limitations of sanctions as a tool for coercion without strong enforcement mechanism. Another challenge which UN Security Council faces is its limited representation and legitimacy. As you know about the composition of the UN Security Council, there are 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. This composition does not fully reflect the geopolitical realities of the 21st century. Therefore, many countries like India argue that UN Security Council lacks legitimacy and representativeness, as it does not adequately represent the interests of the broader international community. This undermines the credibility and effectiveness of the UN Security Council's decisions, especially when they are perceived as being driven by the interests of a few powerful states. The UN Security Council also faces challenges in responding effectively to humanitarian crises and protecting civilian populations in conflict-affected areas. Obstacles such as restrictions on humanitarian access, attacks on humanitarian workers, and the politicization of aid delivery can impede efforts to provide essential assistance to those who are in need. Ensuring compliance with international humanitarian law and holding perpetrators of atrocities accountable remain ongoing challenge for the UN Security Council. Like the present Israel-Palestine conflict, it poses complex challenges to the UN Security Council in responding to humanitarian crises and protecting civilian population in Palestine. This UN Security Council also struggles to handle the emerging security threats such as terrorism, cyber warfare, climate change, pandemics. These threats transcend national borders and require collective action and innovative approaches to address them effectively. The UN Security Council's traditional mechanisms and mandates may not always be suitable for addressing these new and evolving challenges. leading to gaps in the international security structure. Another challenge which UN Security Council faces is the lack of consensus on reforms. Efforts to reform the UN Security Council to address its structural and procedural shortcomings have been hampered by the disagreements among member states. Debates over issues such as the expansion of permanent membership, the abolition of the veto power, and the allocation of seats to different regions have stalled progress on reform initiatives. This lack of consensus on reform perpetuates the existing deficiencies of the UN Security Council and undermines its credibility and effectiveness. These are the that limit the ability of the UN Security Council to fulfill its mandate of maintaining international peace and security. So, in this lecture, we have seen that the UN Security Council plays an important role in maintaining international peace and security and shapes international relations. But at the same time, it also faces some challenges that limit its effectiveness. Addressing these challenges will require reforms to enhance the representativeness, transparency, and responsiveness of the UN Security Council, as well as greater cooperation and coordination among member states. Thank you.